Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast. My name is Philip Ideson, a 20-year procurement practitioner, former head of procurement and advisor to procurement leaders around the world. I started Art of Procurement to help leaders and their teams access the resources they need to increase their impact through insight-driven procurement. You are listening to our flagship podcast where we pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics and tools that leading procurement teams are using to align their impact with the needs of their business. Before I introduce today's guest, I want to let you know that we just launched a brand new version of AOP Mastermind. It's our private Art of Procurement community, which includes a no-cost version just for procurement practitioners. We're really excited to be able to finally publish this. We've been working on this for a long time. Now, free access includes early access to each podcast, a transcript and bite-sized outtakes, as well as open access to a wide range of resources and webinars. So if you want to get this podcast a few days in advance, if you want to read the transcript associated with it, you want to just jump straight to some of the selected outtakes, you can do all of that within the community version, which is our free version of AOP Mastermind. So if that's something you're interested in, we would love to see you within the community. You can apply to join for free. It is practitioner only. And you can do that at artofprocurement.com/mastermind. That's artofprocurement.com/mastermind. Today on the show, I welcome Leah Power. Leah is not a procurement professional. In fact, she spends a lot of her time as EVP of Agency Operations at the Institute of Communications Agencies, actually helping creative services firms respond to procurement. But I invited Leah onto the pod to share her perspectives on how we, as procurement professionals, can actually more effectively support our stakeholders who buy creative-based services throughout the sourcing process. I think it's something that we often struggle with, particularly when a firm's creative ability and therefore the value that they ultimately bring for our stakeholders is not something that's easily identifiable from a traditional RFP process. And while our conversation does focus on marketing and creative agencies within marketing, I think the principles that we discuss can easily be applied to any creative or innovative work that we are looking to buy. Okay, well, let's go into the conversation. And I start by asking Leah if she can just share a little bit more about her background.
So my background is agency side. I worked for about 20 years in finance and operations roles in independent and network agencies, both creative and media, direct, a couple of different types of agencies. And so about 3 years ago, I decided to take a little break from agency, and we had new leadership at our trade association, the ICA.
Yeah.
And I felt that it was time to just pivot, and I wanted to help agency without being inside agency at this point. And I just got along really well with the new leadership at our trade association, and thought this is what I want to do. We had a really fabulous conversation. I had a lot of ideas about things that I thought could be useful for the agency ecosystem. And so then joined the ICA, the Institute of Communication Agencies in Canada, and joined them about 3 years ago. So I've been there 3 years in September, and, really used my understanding of agency, working with procurement, working with marketing. I negotiated a lot of contracts and thought I can take those perspectives. And now being on the flip side, just a shift. I'm adjacent to agency, and I thought I can really help agencies from that perspective.
Where does working with procurement rank in kind of the list of challenges that you see for agencies? Is it something that's, a lot of agencies have as a high priority of better understanding that procurement relationship and getting stronger relationships with procurement? Or is it kind of down the list of a long list of other concerns that you work on with agencies to help them?
I would say working with procurement is very high in the list of top three concerns for agencies. Part of that is it is such a different language. And what I talk about with my agencies a lot of the time is that really both procurement and agency actually want the same thing, and you're driving towards the same goals. You just speak a different language.
Right.
But that can be very daunting when you're sitting across the table from somebody and you feel that you're being commoditized and minimized. And you're not speaking the same language. You don't understand what they want. You don't understand how to communicate who you are. It can be very, very trying and very exhausting for an agency to deal with that. So I think that is a definite concern, especially because when you're looking at where procurement pops their head up, it's at very sensitive and pivotal times in the agency and client relationship.
Yeah.
We're talking about during agency search, contract negotiations, renegotiations, scoping. Those are all very sensitive, very high stress times for both sides.
Yeah, and for us on the procurement side, I think that there's no kind of consistent way in which we approach negotiations and relationships like this. It varies greatly from one procurement organization to the next. And marketing for us is often kind of that last area of spend that procurement teams seek to get involved in, but they're not always successful, at least successful early in a journey to increase procurement's impact and influence. And when we do start to get involved in marketing, it's then oftentimes what I'd say are the more commoditized areas of spend. Like, for example, and I'm sure people will hit back and say, hey, that's not a commoditized area of spend, but it's things like promotional things and print and, things that certainly are not related to services and professional services. So it's like the highest of the marketing is often the toughest area for us to get into. And then when we do, creative is like the thing that the marketing teams often try and shield and protect from procurement the most. And so I think that like I say, it's going to be very different, the experience that an agency has from one procurement organization to the next.
Absolutely. It really depends on the relationship between marketing and procurement on the brand side, how they connect to each other, how they relate to each other and talk to each other, as well that procurement department's philosophy. Yeah. And one thing that really struck me when I came to the ICA, I believe I was at the ICA. I had gone to the ANA conferences previously, but it was at one of the conferences where it was the dean of the sourcing department from Michigan, and I believe it was USC San Diego. And they said, we don't teach procurement people out of our programs how to source creative services. We leave that up to the marketing professionals. Yeah. And there was literally a gasp in the audience. There were a lot of procurement professionals in the audience, but there were a lot of marketers as well. And just that pressure then at that point to go, wait, I have to do my day job as a marketer and I have to teach procurement how to source this very unique service. And I think so true to your point, Philip, is that we understand that marketing, especially from the creative service agency, what we're providing is a small amount of spend when you look at it in respect of the commodities that a procurement department is also responsible for. In some respects, the contract isn't going to come up for 3 to 5 years. So that's a lot of time in between that maybe a particular procurement department's not kind of reaching into the marketing department and really understanding the landscape. And so that can really be a very daunting task for a procurement group. And I totally understand from procurement, you're going to you're going to manage the procurement process and the agency search process the way you were trained. And the way that most procurement folks are trained is through direct services, because that's where the bulk of what you're doing is. So you're going to go down the path of least resistance, and why wouldn't you? Totally understand that. The problem is you're trying to put a round peg into a square hole, and you are not going to get the outcomes that you're looking for by commoditizing such a custom and complex product and service as what an agency is going to be providing to your marketing team.
Now, that's a great segue into something that You shared with me a recent white paper around the traditional RFP process and why that often isn't well suited to selecting agencies or really any other strategic services where there's a large human element involved in them. And I just wonder if you could share, first of all, a little bit from what you've seen from an RFP perspective, why these might not be a particularly good fit for things like sourcing creative agencies.
Right. Well, I think the best way to kind of describe it is to talk about what we feel the best practice is, can kind of highlight why a commoditized RFP is not a good practice. And so we are proponents of something called qualifications-based selection, QBS for short, and it's something that is well known in the United States. It's legislated by, I believe, 47 states, and another 2 use it, although it's not legislated. And that is in the procurement of public infrastructure projects when they're dealing with architecture and engineering. And essentially it says that you cannot use price to determine who the supplier of that infrastructure project is going to be. And there is a reason for that, because the price that someone is going to submit is not going to show how they can replicate success. So qualification-based selection says, quite simply, look at the qualifications of this partner. You need to be able to understand, how did they do something previously in order to showcase how they will do something for you. And so where this starts coming to be an issue is, of course, when you look at commoditized, RFPs, and you want a fitting for something. I don't know much about oil and gas fittings, but say you're going to be spending, $1 million on some fitting. You want to see what that fitting looks like. You want to be able to touch it. You want to feel it. You want to see the specs on it. But when you are dealing with strategic and creative services, that, looking at what they're going to create, or what we call speculative work or spec work, whether that's creative or strategy, you're really asking that agency to go away into a dark room, into a vacuum, and come up with creative ideas for your business. They don't know much about your business yet, no matter how involved your RFP deck is. That may show all those things about your business. They can't possibly know. The best creative comes from a collaborative, meeting of the minds between 2 groups. And so when the issue with RFP, if you're looking at a commoditized based RFP, it wants to, create a grid and say, plop all your stuff into this grid. I want to be able to benchmark it. I want to be able to look at what your hourly rate is for this and that. But it's very 2-dimensional. And there's no understanding really of, well, how does your business work? How does my business work? What's the process that we use to get to our great ideas and our strategic, direction? And so, for me, speculative creative is kind of one of the biggest issues that we see with RFPs coming out of procurement. As well, not understanding what the budget is. Also, a ton of paperwork, which again, where we're asked questions. I know a lot of times I've been responsible for filling out a number of RFPs where I'm looking at the questions and going, so how does this relate to what it is that you're asking me to provide your company? And just knowing that it comes from a very different business, that you were supposed to be sourcing for, a very commoditized business. And so it starts that relationship off in a very low innovation place. Another problem with traditional RFPs is because the second, even if price is 5% of the evaluation, I can guarantee you that agencies, because I've done this myself, we flip through the RFP to get to that part to see what that evaluation is. And what it does is it takes me right away to a low innovation mindset, because I start thinking, what price do I have to put through in order to get this work? It encourages me to look for scope holes, which you do not want. And so anyway, all that to say, it takes us to a low innovation place. And that is the exact opposite of what you want from a creative service. When we look at commoditized RFPs that are based on price can actually create innovation within a commoditized business. Within a creative services business, it does the opposite. And so that's definitely a tenet of QBS.
Yeah, when I want to come back to kind of the price discussion in a little while. When I come back to thinking about, well, there's a couple of things to kind of bring up with what you just shared there. One of the things is, I think one of the reasons that some of the questions you said about filling in information that isn't necessarily relevant to the scope of work that the RFP is for. And honestly, I think that's a really good tell as to whether this is going to be a strategic relationship or a transactional relationship. Because you'll have, oftentimes it's based on the person who has put the RFP together. And if that person has put together the RFP without necessarily knowing or understanding truly what they're buying, then it will just be a point scoring exercise. And questions like that are a good tell because either they've just copied and pasted an RFP from a different bid that they've run, or there's just some, here is your standard template and we've got to ask all these questions. So it just does drive it down to commoditizing as much as possible. And I'm sure that's a red flag from your perspective. The other thing is, we use RFPs sometimes to be able to go, what's the best way of saying it? It's like you're going and catching fish in the ocean. You're just going with a big net and you throw it out to everybody. And then the RFP is built to allow you to quickly go from 20 different agencies, let's say, to 5 different agencies. To then be able to do additional due diligence from there. So it's like the first step in the process. But I'm wondering, when I think about that, how often do you see agencies involved in pitches when they're fighting against 20 different competitors versus it being kind of the same 5 or 6 agencies that come up every time that a good buyer should know all about without having to ask questions of?
I think that's a really good point because we see that happening a lot. And we see cattle calls where RFPs are put out in the full form of the RFP out into the ether. They'll post it either on LinkedIn or with one of the trade magazines. And that you could have anywhere from a network agency submitting that RFP down to a 2-person freelance team. Yeah. And really what you should be doing, and we talk a lot about this in the QBS guide, is you cannot skip that RFI step if you do not know already who the 6 to 8 agencies are that you would like to invite to the RFP portion or the stage 2 portion. You have to do the RFI. And I think a lot of people are trying in procurement are there's no bad intent. I think they're just trying to, I don't know the landscape. I want to get as many people as possible. If I'm going to be buying pencils, this is what I would do. So again, that commoditized mindset. And I want to have as much choice as possible. Here's the problem with that. When you're looking at a commodity, it is simpler for someone to fill in that grid for you and all of that information. They probably can press a button and give you their specs and determine what they're going to send through as their pitch. And you can probably use a software program that's going to help you benchmark that and understand which one you want to go to. It's very price driven. It's very benchmarkable. When you apply that same thinking to creative services, you are just causing a lot of added expense in the agency sector. And I will say this, you are just causing that expense to flow down to the brand level. The clients will pick up that expense. It is a huge expense, as soon as you even have a grid to say, well, tell me what a team might look like, I cannot tell you how many hours it takes to think of that. And again, you're thinking about that in a vacuum, because again, whatever scope you've been provided with, you're either coming up with yourself or it's limited. And you haven't even had a discussion with anybody yet about whether that scope's appropriate for what they're looking for, whether that scope is going to get them the things that they want. So, again, going into that strategic or transactional, it is a red flag as soon as we see that there are agencies participating in a search where you're talking about either a cattle call when there's going to be 100 people participating, or there are 20 people that are being invited. And a lot of times they don't say on the RFP, which again, with QBS, we're very much proponents of put it out there. How many people are you inviting to this? We do encourage people to tell who the participants are. Not everybody wants to do that, and that's fine. But I think at least letting people know I'm up against 6 other agencies, or I'm up against 5 other agencies. And then that, there isn't a huge expense in the industry. That the client is serious. That they've done some due diligence beforehand. And hopefully if this is a new area that they're going into, hopefully they've done an RFI. And again, we have a template in QBS, very simple. And you want it to be simple. You want someone in a few words. I think I limit it to 250 words. Tell me why you should work for my business. Think about if you had 100 of those, where it was just a 250 word paragraph that you had to read and decide, compared to 100 people answering your 35-page RFP that includes spec, that includes a deck that's 90 pages, on and on and on, grids and scopes, and your team has to look through that. So again, that's where we really try to let people understand that QBS was written for clients on the marketing and procurement side. It's to help you have an efficient and an effective search.
Yeah, and frankly, we don't look through all those RFP responses anyway, because you get,
we know that.
20 of them all, back in the day when you would, I'm embarrassed and ashamed to say this, but, there'd be a time when you would require them to be mailed to you, by a certain time, and for it to come and arrive on your desk, and the person from the mailroom would come up with boxes and boxes of these things, and they just sit next to your desk forever, because you just never have the chance to go through them, and you look at it and think, it's all marketing stuff anyway. So it was like this whole charade when that information isn't even particularly used. But we're really, really big proponents at Data Procurement, and the work that we do and the work we do with clients as well is, on the RFI process. So learn as much as you possibly can in all the disqualifiers in a simple RFI. And then you can go into more in-depth discussions and due diligence with just the people who you would seriously, that you would award the business to if everything made sense. Don't use the RFP process as a way to feel out whether somebody's appropriate or not, just from things that you could easily ascertain from asking some simple questions up front.
Yeah, and I think anecdotally, there is a feeling in agency that many procurement people, or maybe more true to the point, the marketing person or the marketing decision maker knows who they fundamentally want to go with. A lot of times as well, incumbents are included when, there's a feeling that really is the incumbent going to be chosen. And
I can tell you why.
Down
why
and decide
why I think that happens with the incumbents is because they don't want to lose any notion that they have there's a relationship there. They don't want to tell them that until they've got a plan B lined up, and so it's like stringing it along.
Exactly.
Versus being open.
And I totally understand that. It really reduces the relationship because the feeling is already kind of there, and we kind of know. So it's like knowing that you don't want to be in a relationship anymore. in your personal life,
yep.
you wouldn't necessarily do that. You shouldn't do that.
Right.
You should, if you're already thinking, I want another relationship, you should kind of let that other person know that this one isn't working out anymore. And we do at some point need to be adults. And really, to be honest with you, Philip, that's why we have contracts.
Yep.
And that's why we have transition agreements in our contracts. We have termination agreements in our contracts. And the agencies that I have worked for, and I've worked for a number, we worked diligently and we worked with fervor and passion right up to the point where we transferred everything on a USB key over to the new agency, and however that transition worked. So I understand where that feeling is coming from, but I think what we'd rather see happen is that incumbent is released from the pressure of participating in that pitch and putting added resources into that pitch if there is no chance that they're going to be chosen. Be honest with them and let them know.
So if we come back to QBS, and what are some of the questions that a procurement organization can ask which will actually give them the best insight into the appropriateness or applicability or ability of a creative agency?
Well, again, the driving force behind QBS is to understand how an agency is going to replicate success. To us, that's the best measure of looking at how your marketing department will be able to connect with this new agency to arrive at the best strategic and creative services and to drive your marketing and ultimately your sales forward. That's the goal. So it's really a case study based methodology. And the case studies that we're a proponent of is performance framed case studies, which essentially says, or process-based, I think you can look at it either way, which essentially says, problem, solution, outcome is usually how people write their case studies. And I've seen them. They're shiny. They look great. It shows a really fabulous, very quick and dirty. This is what we did. This was the problem, and this is how we solved it, and isn't this great? What a process-based case study asks the agency to do is to pull apart and showcase exactly how they came up with that winning idea. Yep. And not from a proprietary perspective, but what were the processes that we went through? How did we create a relationship that was based on collaboration and partnership to get us to where we came up with an idea? And when I consult with clients, and I don't usually actually consult with agencies on QBS, but I'm consulting with clients, and I say to them, look for case studies that show a challenge. Where did something go wrong? That's what you want to know. You don't want to know all the shiny pieces. You want to see something where, what did we learn? Where was there, a bump in the road, and this is how we got through it? Because I will guarantee you there has been no fabulous can winning or Effie winning campaign out there that didn't have a bump in the road, where you needed to pivot, where you needed to, find a different way of putting something out into the marketplace. So how did they do that? And so when I am consulting with clients, I ask them to look for that. And if they don't get that in the case study, what the next process is once those case studies are received and reviewed, there is an interview process. And think of an interview process in the same way from an HR perspective. You're interrogating when you're hiring looking at hiring a candidate. You're interrogating that resume. Yeah. Same thing in interview in the QBS. You're interrogating that case study. And if it looks really shiny and you don't see those missteps and those bumps, ask about them. What happened? Where was a challenge? It's exactly the way we deal with a candidate in the HR process. How did you deal with the challenge when it came up, right? That's what we want to know, because that's what our life is made of. It's made of bumps in the road, and we have to come up with a creative solution to that problem. And that's what agencies do. And that's what you're trying to figure out. Okay, we know there's going to be problems. How are you going to creatively get through it? And how are you going to work with our team in order to do it well?
Yeah, what I like about the idea of the process-based case study is that it does take away some of the individuals who are on that account for that case study, if you will. So it's easy when you look at creative work to say, well, the end result is based on the people that were on the account. And, so the risk to me is what happens if that person leaves or they're not on the account or whatever. So you're demonstrating the kind of the infrastructure behind it to show how you can drive consistent results, regardless of who is on the account. But obviously the fact of the type of people that are on the account is a differentiator, but not necessarily the individuals that are on the account. So I can definitely see why that's a strong way of understanding a little bit more about what goes in to enable an agency to scale those results across multiple clients.
Mm-hmm. And that's one of the downfalls of speculative creative and asking people to come up with ideas in a vacuum, is you don't know who that is who worked on that work. You don't know who that team is. You don't know how they came up with it. And I would hazard a guess that once the work's awarded, you will never come up with an idea that way again, right? You will never work in that same way during that pitch process. If you've asked for speculative creative, you'll never work that way again.
Yeah, I'm sure
it's a benchmark of nothing.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm sure that
it's a benchmark of nothing.
Some of the larger agencies will just have, the SWAT team who that's all they do. So it's people that are particularly talented in being able to put together speculative creative, at short notice, and it may not be implementable even, but that's what they do and that's what they're the best at. And so they're running through this so it's as much a mirage as anything, what the results are.
I think that's a really great point and fabulous word to say that it's a mirage, because there have been articles written where people figure it's less than 5% of spec creative that actually makes it in market. And, there will, even if you do like something out of the agency search process that was speculative, it will need rework before it goes in market anyway. So,
So I have to ask about the elephant in the room then, and that's price. From a procurement perspective, I think things are changing a little bit when it comes to marketing. Like there's a realization and a recognition amongst the most mature procurement organizations that you cannot necessarily measure success with marketing in the same way that you measure success in a lot of the other things that we buy. And those are the procurement organizations who are probably most successful in building that collaborative relationship with marketing, and where they are working on agency pitches where it feels like it's a team effort versus procurement's just running the process. But we can never get away from the fact that deep within our psyche is this idea that we're there to protect our organization from being taken advantage of from a cost perspective. And that's even for me, who is I feel that I'm a big advocate of procurement thinking differently. It's something that still makes me nervous, is not really involving price in a process. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about how as a procurement professional we can be comfortable that the work that will end up coming as a result of the relationship is going to be priced appropriately when price isn't necessarily a part of the decision-making process.
Absolutely. So, and I think you make a really good point, because it's really this idea of cost versus investment. And when you are using a commoditized based RFP, you are looking to buy marketing services and put it into the cost bucket rather than put it into the investment bucket. So when we're talking about doing a search from a QBS perspective, we're really trying to get procurement to look at marketing creative services as an investment in their business. And so it's a little bit of a mind shift. And of course, you're absolutely right. Price is hugely important. And I come from the finance and operations side of an agency. And so I totally understand how price is important, because I was also responsible for dealing with my suppliers at the agency. So I totally get it. I was also on the other side of the equation. And negotiating price is definitely part of QBS. What makes it different, and what can very, very easily turn a commoditized RFP into a QBS RFP, is literally taking price down to be 0 rated. Mm-hmm. So what that means is we're asking you to do all the qualification work first, and then negotiate price, and then look at price. So you are choosing that number one agency and then negotiating the price. It doesn't mean that agency is going to necessarily do what you want them to do for the price that you want to pay. That's something that you have to kind of figure that out. And again, looking at the way that we hire someone on the HR side of things, we may put out there that we have a $50,000 job posting. Yeah. And you have people come through, and you might look at 3 candidates and say, oh, I've got this one that it looks like we might have to pay them 55. Mm-hmm. I've got someone else. It looks like after I've interviewed them, I bet we can get them for 50. We've got someone else that will grow into the role, and they're at 45. That happens all the time, right? And so you may actually, for a $50,000 posting, actually hire someone at 55, because you see that benefit in that $5,000 incremental thought leadership and what they bring to that role. And so it's the same for an agency when we're looking at that investment perspective. Do I want to, the way that they've presented their pricing, the way that they've identified the scope? Have they showed me where there's a hole in my scope? Have they said, listen, we're telling you this is what it's going to cost. I know your budget, and I've seen this happen. Your budget's $500,000. It can't be done for that, and I'll tell you why. Mm-hmm. And that's part of what you want as well. You don't want someone saying to you, I can do it for that, and here's my price, and it's going to be really great, and then put through a ton of change orders. That is the last thing that a procurement team wants to see happen, because it looks good at the outset, not so good when you're looking at it from the back end, where the cost overruns just rise and rise and rise. So really, fundamentally, we want you to get the best firm that you can afford. So if your budget and your threshold for price doesn't maybe necessarily allow you to get the most award-winning FE and CAN winning agency. Maybe the one that won, the one show, or has some pencils in their in their coffers. Maybe that's not who you can afford. Yeah. And that's okay, because that's why you have number 2. Still great. And in fact, all 3 of those final agencies should be well able to manage your business. You're looking for the best qualified that you can afford.
And so from a procurement perspective, that as an agency, you're looking for the business, let's say whether that's marketing, whether it's procurement, whoever it is that's involved in that process, to be a lot more forthcoming about budgets. So that at least at the beginning they have, because the worst thing you can do is you go through this whole process and you pick somebody and then you find out, well, the reason that they were wonderful is because they're 3 times more expensive. So at least give some information up front so that they can assess whether it's a piece of work that they want to go after. And then you're kind of negotiating the finer details of that when you've essentially made a selection, a sourcing decision, and then it comes to negotiation.
Absolutely. And I think that's sometimes a hard thing for procurement people to wrap their head around when they're creating the RFP. They really hesitate to put a budget amount in. Mm-hmm. A lot of times they think, well, that's proprietary. Yep. Okay.
Data is power.
That's one way of looking at it.
It's how we're brought up.
Yeah. And the other thing is that they just think it's a piece of information that isn't relevant. But I think, to your point, it absolutely is relevant, because what you're trying to do in a commoditized RFP is have as many people and companies participating in that RFP as possible, right? We understand that you want to benchmark, you want to get as much data as possible in that, that drive, that RFP drive. On the creative services side, it's the opposite. Mm-hmm. You actually, and this is hard for procurement people to wrap their head around, this is not the way you're trained, but you want people to take themselves out of the agency search process. You want them to self-select out of that if it is not something that is going to work for them. And maybe one of those, it's not going to work for us, is we think we're way too expensive for you. Your budget just will not do what you need it to do. And then, the other thing is people don't want to put a budget in because they don't want to be held to it.
Right.
And my response to that is, it's the same way. I'm going to go back to that job posting. No one holds you to that, right? That number, you put that in there because you want candidates to self-select out. Oh, $100,000? Mm-hmm. Ooh, maybe that's, I'm overqualified for a job at that posting, or I'm underqualified for a job at that posting, right? You want people who are appropriately qualified for that. It doesn't mean, again, going to that you're absolutely going to pay $100,000. We know that doesn't necessarily work, but it's a benchmark for the person who's going to be participating in the process to say, this is around what I'm looking for. Yeah. And do I think I'm in that neighborhood? And then you negotiate.
Yeah, it's one of the hardest things for us is to put numbers on the table, because, like I say, that feeling that we've been brought up that information is power, and it's that whole leverage mindset that, we're obviously trying to encourage people to, we encourage people all the time across categories to try and move away from that. But the mindset of, when I know the numbers and the other party doesn't, it gives me some kind of upper hand in negotiation. And that's the mindset shift for procurement. I think also something is, in some organizations, and this is probably those, again, that have somebody who's maybe running this from a marketing perspective, who doesn't have experience in the category. So they're looking at this as a project, a transactional or a process to drive, as opposed to thinking about outcomes, is more likely going to be looking at this and saying, okay, this is $2 million of spend, and I think I can get 10% savings. So I'm on track to get $200,000 that I can apply to my savings goal. And they want to know how they're tracking to that all the way through the project. And that gives them the reason why they want to understand, like, why they may not be putting numbers and budget numbers out if there's more budget that they can take out. So it's how you're measured as a procurement professional. It's the mindset you go into a project, and whether you're really thinking about your role as being aligned with what the business needs, and as you say, you're looking at it as an investment, or whether you're looking at this as an opportunity for you to drive more savings to help your objectives as opposed to the marketer's objectives. At which point you look at this as more of a transaction. So
when you're looking at it from that cost perspective and trying to find savings, you're really missing the point of that is an investment that is going to drive sales in your business. And when you even look at your own personal investments, of course you want to be as efficient and as effective with your investments, but you're not looking for savings in your investment. What you're looking for is value. Mm-hmm. So you want value added. And so having a discussion with an agency about how to really, kind of monetize with those value adds that they can provide, you enter into a much more robust and richer relationship with your agency. If you come at it from a cost savings perspective, you're commoditizing them and you're never going to be a true partner. Right. But if you just switch that around and say, what value can you add? And try to get, we're talking about creative professionals. We do everything from a creative problem solving perspective. Get us to problem solve our way through that with the marketing team and with the procurement team. And let's come up with some ways that we can enrich the money you do have, the budget you do have. Just give us an opportunity to put our thinking caps on from a creative perspective and work in a partnership relationship with you, and we'll be able to drive success.
Well, Leah, I've loved this conversation. I know it's about time to wrap up, so I just want to finish on an easy question. And I do want to say, before I ask that, I think this is something that you can apply not just to marketing creative, but any creative services, any professional services, based services. So, I want listeners who are listening into this to kind of broaden the types of products or services that they buy that they think they may be able to apply this process to. But yeah, the easy question that I was going to ask you is that if listeners are interested in learning a little bit more about QBS, learning a little bit more about yourself, where would be the best place for them to go?
Absolutely. It's a great question. So go to our website, which is www.theica.ca and /QBS. And so it's an easy website. You just go there. There's a little one pager on there that gives you some kind of the broad strokes of QBS. Fill out a little form and we'll send you the PDF. And we are happy at no charge to consult with client procurement and marketing. We think that you absolutely should be able to manage this process yourself. And it's efficient and it's effective, and we're happy to help any step of the way that we can.
Perfect. Well, I'm going to also include links to that on our show notes page for today's episode. With all the podcasts that we have, they're all at artofprocurement.com/podcast. That's artofprocurement.com/podcast. And there'll be links to Leah's profile as well on LinkedIn, to the ICA, and to QBS specifically. So as we wrap up one last time, Leah, I just want to thank you so much for joining me today. I want to thank you for listening into today's episode of The Art of Procurement. To go deeper, including access to transcripts and actionable outtakes from the podcast, join the free level of our AOP Mastermind community. To learn more, go to artofprocurement.com/mastermind. And to find our entire back catalogue of almost 400 episodes,